chat for your questions or comments, and the facilitators will read them anonymously. Our topic tonight is, this is our first Tuesday, and on the first Tuesdays we to do, and we usually succeed at it, having an ARAOMC topic, and we are certainly have one tonight. And the topic is Love Through Action, Addressing Police in Our Home City. And it's going to be led by Beck, Schillizzi, who is our Membership and Social Justice Coordinator, and Lyla Gibbons, who is the lead organizer for Song Buckhead. And our chalice words will be read by Beck, and I will light this tiny chalice. The words are read.
Awesome. You ready to read?
Yes.
All right. So this is from Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb, which some of y'all may have seen and heard at the inauguration. So it's an excerpt from that. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours. Before we knew it, somehow we do it. Somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. May it be so, blessed be. All right, June, should we get started?
Yes.
Awesome.
Go for it.
So I just want to start with kind of letting y'all know who we are. I think most people know who I am, but just to say a little bit about my background as it pertains to this presentation. I do have a master's of social work, and I have spent some time in that master's really diving deeply into criminalization, and specifically criminalization of people of neurodivergence, including psychiatric disabilities and cognitive disabilities. And so a lot of the stuff that I have researched kind of informs a lot of the way that I do justice work. And so yeah, that's kind of like a lot of the framework that I'm coming from. And then I also brought Lyla on. And Lyla, do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Lyla Gibbons, and I was connected to Beck and a part of a group that is affiliated with song and organizing in Buckhead. The Atlanta Song Chapter of Buckhead, kind of like some Black organizers in song kind of called on white members in song to do some organizing in Buckhead, especially after some recent passing of ordinances that just kind of chip away at bail reform and other wins that they've been able to have in the city of Atlanta, and a lot of that energy coming out of Buckhead to kind of chip away at that. So that's kind of the context. We're new. We've only been kind of organizing since November together. Eliza is on the call as well, who's a member of that group. And so we're just excited to continue to build relationship with people. And if anyone is interested in learning more or connecting with me, connecting to the work, learning more about what we're doing in Buckhead, then I'd love to connect with you all at the end. And we'll have a form you can fill out too.
Awesome, thank you, Lyla. Yeah. We also a bit like Song's been around for like what, 40, 50 years now? Mm-hmm. Song is a pretty much an institution for especially LGBT justice as it relates to other issues, including racial justice and economic justice, and especially in the South. So I learned a lot of my social justice stuff from them. So they're the ones to thank for if I know anything. It's definitely related to Song. And so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right, y'all see that pretty good? Okay, so we called this Love Through Action, addressing police brutality in our home city. I will say that we'll be specifically focusing on criminalization. That's like a big part of police brutality. And yeah, and just like really thinking about both how we can act, but also how we can come from a loving place. And in that, I want us to really ground ourselves first in the land that we're on. I think that we've started to make this more of a habit at UUCA, which I love, as acknowledging the indigenous land that we are on. So we're specifically in Atlanta, we are on Muskogee National Land, and that is where we do our work. I also want us to come from a holistic place when we're talking about criminalization, both in the sense of both our head, in the sense of like, you know, what's the data, what's the facts, all that kind of stuff, but also our heart and thinking about what it means to be a person of empathy, and so kind of balancing those two things and not relying on one or the other too heavily. And then also the micro and the macro. And what I mean by that is kind of more on the thinking about the individual, why can't I say individual? The individual level, and also like the community level, but also kind of the big picture, right? Of what criminalization means in America, the kind of big trends, all that kind of stuff. So just balancing and being holistic about how we're thinking about this. And then of course, the chalice lighting, grounding ourselves in our spirituality and our creative selves. And so I would like us to start by thinking about the Black Lives Movement. Oops, I went a little bit too far. The Black Lives Movement, because ARE did this really awesome process to figure out what y'all really wanted to learn about, and racial justice was the big thing. And I think a lot of that comes out of like how much Black Lives Matter really brought it in 2020. And they really kind of brought to the forefront issues of policing, of police brutality, but also issues of criminalization. And starting to think about, like, when we think about crime, who do we think about and who gets labeled a criminal? And so this one picture right here is from a Millennial March of Faith in Atlanta that Big Bethel organized, the African American Methodist Church. And so I think this sign really is really poignant in thinking about like how we think about crime, right? He's saying like, my skin color is not a crime. And so we're about to play a video, and to make sure that we don't have any issues with copyright, we are going to be pausing the recording. And so for those who are video that we're about to play, and we're going to be playing the first like 2 minutes of the video. So if you are watching on YouTube after the fact, go ahead and pause this, go watch that video, and then come back. And then for everybody who is here live, we're going to be watching it live. All right. And then get the video get paused, the recording. And can y'all still see the presentation? Okay, just want to make sure. So when we're thinking about criminalization, I really love this quote from a song zine that they had put out on criminalization. What would it look like if we started situating folk who cause harm as survivors of the harm they've gone through? How would our relationship to harm shift if we framed harmed as needs that are denied, not met? Will we get to the root cause of the harm? Could we prevent the same types of harm from reoccurring? So as we're going through and talking about criminalization and like thinking about crime, like I think we, especially if you're a person of privilege, it's very easy to get into a place of fear. And so I think taking a step back from that and coming from a place of like, of love, and that's also a deep place of understanding and thinking not just about how to stop crime from happening, but how to prevent kind of those preventative measures. And so now I'm going to zoom out a bit. Ooh, it's getting real dark in here. I'm going to zoom out a bit, and we're going to get a little bit macro and look at some big data. And some of this might be really familiar to you, some of it might be new, but just to make sure that we have the context before kind of diving into Atlanta specifically. So mass incarceration. So over the past like 50 years, incarceration has super been on the rise in the United States. We have the highest rate of incarcerated people in the world in our country. It's also in 40 years, it went up about 500%. And so you'll see that happen right there. We're starting to go down, but the rate at which we're going down is much lower than the rate that we went up. And there's a lot of things that caused this, right? But what hasn't caused it is changes in crime rate. So there hasn't been big shift in crime rate. This has more been, it's about changes in law and policy that has created this big shift. And so some of this has to be to do on the war on drugs. Some of it has to do with kind of these being tough on crime policies. A big thing is that prison sentences are just a lot longer. So the number of people serving life sentences have exponentially gone up. And so that increases the population. One thing that is particularly like wrong or hard about that is that when you're looking at people who are participating in this kind of harm, this kind of stuff usually peaks in the mid to late teens. And the rates of recidivism for people who are in their 30s and 40s are super low. So crime usually happens in this particular age window. And so if you take someone who is in prison at 19 and then have them for life, the chances of them doing the same actions at 50 are super low. And so you have people who are in jail for life for something that maybe they did when they were a teenager, which yet again, just a huge amount of people who are imprisoned. And then thinking about who are these people, like who are the people that are in prison? And of course, Black Lives Matter have really brought into the light of a race, right? You know, we're primarily seeing people of color in prison. And while it might seem that not as many Black women are in prison, that rate is actually going up. For women in general is going up for incarceration rates, but especially Black women. And so this is from, I think this data is from 2017, and so it's probably gone up since then. But as you can see, like the people who are in prison are generally people of color. And so a lot of this has to do with racial profiling, but another big factor is poverty. So criminalization of poverty is like one of the biggest factors. So basically the median annual income of someone going into prison, so this is not someone who's already been in prison, but someone who's going into prison, is around $19,000 a year. Now thinking about the average median is like 41% higher. So you're looking at $40,000, $50,000 a year for the average median person. And so a lot of times when we're talking about people in prison, we're talking about people who are living in poverty. And a lot of this has to do with specific legislation that is aimed at people in poverty. So criminalization of debt is a big one. Also the cash bail system, which I think that Lyla might talk even more about, but is just like being able to pay money in order to get out of jail is the thing in the United States. Also motor vehicle laws that criminalize the poor. So for instance, if your tail lights out, you get a citation for that and you don't have money to do anything about that, but you need your car to go to work, right? And so next thing you know, you're in prison for not being able to do anything about your taillight, or you can't afford car insurance. And so you're driving without car insurance. We live in this country that doesn't have a lot of good public transportation. Civil asset forfeiture is a particularly like wild one. Basically in the United States, and especially in Georgia, we have laws that allow law enforcement agencies to seize property. So this could be your home, this could be your car, this could be the cash in your wallet, without a warrant, without conviction or criminal charges. If all they need is a suspect that the property has been involved in criminal activity. And then it's on you to prove that it wasn't involved in criminal activity. So say they see a person, probably a person of color walking down the street. They have $200 in their wallet. They think they look suspicious. They think they're selling drugs. So they take the $200. And that person has no real way of, especially since they don't have legal representation, of proving that they were not involved in selling drugs. And so like just the Atlanta Police Department has, and so that money gets, I think up to 80% of that money gets filtered into law enforcement budgets. And so looking at Atlanta Police Department, over the past like 3 or 4 years, they have spent $4 million from asset forfeiture. So that's huge, right? And that's a huge double interest. And the people that are mostly targeted are people of color and people in poverty. And so maybe that $200 you could have used to pay your car insurance. Now you don't have it. And so then the cycle continues. Lack of access to good legal representation. And then of course the collateral consequences of the prison system. So this is, once you've been in the prison system, it's harder to get jobs. It is harder to land back on your feet. And so it's a cycle. And the biggest indicator of recidivism for being back in prison is not being able to get a job within the first year. And so you don't meet the requirements for, oh my God, now I'm forgetting the word for it, but you don't meet the requirements of, oh my God, Lyla, remind me of when you get out of prison and
Probation?
you have to, say again?
Probation?
Probation. Oh my God, y'all. Sometimes I have issues with finding words. But yeah, so you don't meet the requirements of probation, which includes getting a job, so you're back in jail. And so this is part of the reason why people will stay in jail longer than they should, or they're supposed to, if they end up in jail for things that maybe they shouldn't be in jail for. And then lastly, criminalization of neurodivergence and disability. So people with disabilities are 3 times as likely to be incarcerated. And so when we talk about disabilities, we're especially talking about cognitive disabilities. So we're especially talking about autism. We're especially talking about Down syndrome. We're especially talking about people with learning disabilities. And then after that, you have psychiatric disabilities. So 1 in 5 inmates have a serious mental illness. And one thing I want to highlight about this is that when we think about serious mental illness and crime, we tend to get these images in our mind, right? We tend to get these images of, things that you'll see on TV as far as cannibalism or these really extreme images. In reality, people who experience psychosis are not more likely to be violent than people who don't experience psychosis. And as a person who is been around people with psychosis quite a bit, it's pretty obvious. They're much more likely to be victims and survivors of violence than to be perpetrators of violence. And so a lot of times what will happen is you have someone who's having a manic episode and they are naked in the streets, and then they are now a sex offender. And so it's not properly handled. And so that's how you end up with having so many people with psychiatric disabilities in incarceration. And then of course, people with disabilities are also more likely to be victims of police brutality. So a lot of times when we're talking about specific people, we're talking about especially Black people with cognitive disabilities. So Black people with autism, Black people who maybe have ADHD and things like that are the people that are particularly targeted. And once at all levels, there's just lack of access, right? Interpretation for people who are deaf, not there, services not there. And so it's just particularly difficult to navigate criminal justice system with a disability, especially if you're in poverty. So now Lyla.
Thanks, Beck. So we're gonna zoom in a little bit to Atlanta and look at the conditions that kind of exist here. And so I didn't know this growing up or until very recently that Atlanta has one of the highest income disparities of any city across the country. One of the #1 cities for income inequality in America. So some things to think about is that if a person is born into poverty in Atlanta, there's only a 4% chance that they'll escape that poverty in their lifetime. So across all measures of household financial security, households of color are faring worse than white households in Atlanta. Almost, so, you know, we think about income, but also assets and kind of business ownership being some ways. You can see here the statistics. And if you go atlantawealthbuilding.org is a website that has a lot more information about this if you're interested in learning more. But almost 70% of Black families are liquid asset poor compared to 22% of white families. And today the median household income for Blacks is just 1/3 of that of whites. And the statistics don't fare much better for Latinx families in Atlanta either. Did I freeze? Am I good?
We're good.
Okay, great. We just lost power. So I should have, my Wi-Fi should have gone out, but it didn't. That's great. Yeah, so when we're talking about the criminalization of poverty, we have to acknowledge what that looks like in reality in Atlanta and those disparities that exist in our city. All right, next slide. Awesome. And so what does this criminalization of poverty look like in Atlanta? And kind of like the last slide showed how closely tied the wealth gap is in Atlanta to race and to Black families and Black individuals being more likely to be poor and in poverty. We can't really, it's hard to separate the criminalization of poverty from the criminalization of race also in the city. And so some ways that has showed up specifically in Atlanta and ways that maybe feel like they happened a long time ago, but are also some other ways that are really relevant today. So the Atlanta City Detention Center is a hot topic these days. Some history around it is that it was built in 1996 ahead of the Olympics, specifically to house the city's poor and homeless, so they would not be seen by Olympic visitors. And they did that through.
Oh no. Looks like Lyla froze. Uh-oh. She gonna come back? I can speak a little bit on this slide, although obviously Lyla has more info while she's hopefully getting her internet figured out. So yeah, so basically, is she back? Oh no, okay. So basically Atlanta City Detention Center, right? So it was created, a lot of people were put in there for loitering, things like that, so that you don't see as many homeless folks on the street. And so it was really created for a lot of city ordinances, and people who are there were generally not people who were perpetrators of violent crime. Also, it ended up being, at some point, it became a detention center as well as just for immigration, as well as a city jail. And so over the years, the amount of people in the jail has dwindled, and so was not really being used. And there was a really big kind of push from the Atlanta community to use this building for something else, right? And specifically to close it down as a jail and to create a community center where there could be access to services for people who are housing insecure, food insecure, things like that. And so I want to say that was decided, that happened about 2 or 3 years ago. And so that's a piece of it, right? Right now, City Council is kind of going back on that sense and wants to lease that building to Fulton County. specifically Fulton County Corrections. Right now, Fulton County Corrections has a super overpopulation that are incarcerated, much like the rest of the United States. And so there's just a lot of things that are happening as far as like COVID that are really bad, as far as infection rates and incarceration. There's just not enough beds. It's just like really, our incarceration in the United States is already really awful, but it's like extra awful because there's just not enough room. And so like, okay, well, why don't we lease this building to Fulton County? For a lot of the people that no longer want this to be a jail, it's like, we already have too many people who are incarcerated in Georgia. And so rather than thinking about being like, oh, the way to fix this problem is by having another building, the way to fix this problem is to think about our issue of over incarceration, right? Another issue with criminalization of poverty in Atlanta is just the pandemic, right? There is just a lot of issues of social and economic hardships because of the pandemic. We're seeing like a huge and awesome upsurge in as far as like your random person giving more or nonprofits, but we're not seeing a huge upsurge as far as the government changing policies to recognize that and to help people who are suffering from poverty related to the pandemic.
Excuse me, Beck. I think.
Are you back?
Yeah, she's back.
Hi.
Okay, you did. Yeah, so I tried to like fill in some of the gaps. I talked a little bit about ACDC's history and where they're at now in the global pandemic. I'm glad that you're back for this one because I don't know this one as well as you do.
Awesome. No, thank you so much for filling in. I'm sorry about that, y'all. I'm on my phone now, so hopefully no more Wi-Fi issues. But yeah, as Beck was saying, so there has been an increase, and I want to put like crime in quotes, right? Like there's been an increase in crime in Atlanta since the pandemic, as well as a lot of other major cities across the country. And so again, thinking about the social, as Beck was saying, the social and economic conditions that lead to people feeling like they're missing something, right? As we talked about at the beginning. And so the response of our city has not been to think about those social and economic conditions as a whole, right? There are pockets of that happening and we want to like support that and build that. But as a whole, there's been further kind of chipping away at, like we were saying before, like bail reform in the city. Specifically, one example is through an ordinance that was passed in the fall around further criminalizing street racing, and that there's a lot of leniency in that ordinance to have things qualify that are kind of just even reckless driving. There's a lot of discretion for police officers. And what that ordinance means is that now if someone is convicted of anything that kind of falls within that reckless driving category, they the judge can issue cash bail for them. So they can require people to pay bail to get out of jail, to have cash on hand, versus being able to do a signature bail, which means I'm signing my name, I promise I'll come back to my court date, and not having to pay money in the moment. There's also been just a real increase in like public safety narrative, especially the work that we do, primarily thinking about Buckhead and more affluent communities. There has just been a real rise in kind of feeding on fear of white residents that then leads to kind of further policing, further surveillance of our communities. And we know that that specifically targets those that are poor and those that are Black in our city. And so there are things like the Buckhead security plan that are kind of coming through, as well as leasing ACDC to Fulton County rather than closing it and creating a center for freedom and wellness that would actually get to some of these social and economic conditions, right? Because the idea is that, you know, it's not, those are the kind of the preventative things that are going to reduce public safety in the long run. So I think I'm bleeding into my next slide a little bit as I'm talking, if you want to move forward. Awesome. So I can certainly share some links in the chat box if people are interested in learning more. Many of you maybe already know this history in Atlanta around the Reimagine ACDC task force
the Close the Jail ATL, which is really a coalition between Women on the Rise and the Racial Justice Action Center in Atlanta. And this was like a very community-led, robust process that was like lauded on a national stage around, you know, how can we reimagine what public safety looks like and what actually creates safety for our communities. And what came out of that task force was thinking about a center for wellness and freedom, like I mentioned on the last page. So how can we provide spaces for, you know, healthcare, economic, education, resources, and kind of like bolstering that way. And there are a lot of people last summer with the uprisings for Black Lives that were going on in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, which I know is more on our mind recently with the trial of Chauvin going on now. But there are 14 hours of public comment leading up to the budget meeting for City Council, asking City Council to reimagine what public safety could look like. And a big thing that has been talked about a lot with thinking about ACDC is there are $32.5 million are spent in keeping ACDC open and operational, you know, so I think there's ways to think about how those money and those resources can be spent to really support the most vulnerable in our community, the most marginalized. So yeah, that is what I was going to share around what's kind of going on locally. Yeah.
I missed the 14 hours of public comment.
Yeah, that was 14 hours of public comment ahead of, I think it was the June City Council meeting where they were discussing the budget. Yeah, for City Council, where they wanted to, not completely, but they wanted to reallocate some of the funds from the police budget to other community resources.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so I want to bring this into a discussion of like, how can we reimagine safety, and what are things that we could potentially do in Atlanta to bolster safety in a way that doesn't rely on systems of racism or oppression. And so let's stop my share now. I see all your beautiful faces, or see some of your faces. Yeah, so if you want to either putting in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and just kind of say like, just thoughts on like how we can, like what we can do in our communities to address this issue. Or just general thoughts, like where's your mind at? Where's your heart at? Yeah, definitely. So Nancy Wiley contact City Council members. What are some of the things that we can think about talking to City Council members about?
So I can share a little more context about some of the, you know, specifically with ACDC. So there was, you know, the task force to reimagine and to close ACDC. There was, you know, legislation signed and passed by City Council to do that. And so now with the kind of narrative around increasing crime and this desire for Fulton County to lease ACDC. So there are two proposals on the table. There's the lease it to Fulton County proposal, and there's the close it and build the Center for wellness and freedom proposal. And so there are some key city council meetings coming up in April on the 19th and the 26th, and there's always public comment ahead of those meetings. So those are definitely opportunities to get engaged with city council, not only during the public comment time, but even like building a relationship, like if you know your city council member, if you've reached out to them to talk to them before and have more of a conversation, then that is always really powerful. And they are all up for re-election this year. So more apt to talk to us than normal, probably.
So we got another comment in the chat, which is the poverty to jail cycle seems overwhelming. Where do you think we can best focus our efforts as mostly older white folks? Most of us live in DeKalb County and not in the city limits. It's a great question. Thank you. What do you think, Lyla?
Yeah, it is overwhelming. I'm with you on that for sure. And I think the more we can like talk about this, I think it's something that's hard to talk about. So I don't know, I feel like a great first place to start, we all, you know, a lot of the people in the group that we're organizing with in Buckhead don't actually live in Buckhead either. We're trying to build connections there, get connected with more Buckhead residents. So, you know, think about the different networks you're a part of, other members of the church that you know that might live there, or we all maybe shop or do business in Buckhead and things like that. So I think there are still ways to, you know, kind of get involved and maybe connect and just talk about it more with your friends, your family, your networks that you're a part of.
Yeah, and I think another piece of it is like, even if you're not a constituent, sorry, even if you're not a constituent per se, a lot of the people who have been really vocal are people of color or younger, so there can be a narrative around them being activists as opposed to community members. And so having this kind of, even if you're not a constituent, being able to play a little bit of respectability politics, of being able to put like on the, like, you know, I'm a professional upper middle class white person from DeKalb. It's not, you know, it's not ideal, and also there's some power in there of being able to be like, hey, like, no, this is real, and putting being able to put that there. And then I saw, what is the best breakout of crime data to use when people express concerns about the rise of crime? I've got some thoughts, but Lyla, you might have some other thoughts.
You go for it first. Let me mull it over.
Yeah, so I think that, so most of the data that I've been using has been from, let me pull it up. So, because, you know, there's a lot of places to get data. I think the thing that actually is probably the most useful is if you look at the, let me find, it's the National Research Council is a really good data to look at, and the reason is that they're looking at the impact of incarceration versus lowering crime rates, and so they're looking at like a pretty big statistical analysis about it, and they're able, a lot of their data, to show that incarcerating more people, the amount that it reduces crime rate is like so minimal to the amount of cost, both economic cost and social cost of incarcerating so many people. And so that's a really good place to start around crime rates, is just being like, hey, like if you're worried about crime rates, like, you know, the data is showing that incarcerating more people and incarcerating people for longer doesn't do the thing that you want it to do. Whereas you put a similar amount of money into preventative programs, we're more likely to see a different impact. So that's one way of looking at it. And and then other places that you can get like crime rates data. Now I have to look at my notes to find it. I found a lot of my data from the sentencing project, and they took a lot of their data specifically from the Bureau of Justice. So that's another place just to like find data around crime rates. And then, does Buckhead Coalition have a position? Do you know anything about that, Lyla?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know the Buckhead Coalition is definitely like in partnership and in kind of similar. They definitely were one of the organizations that are signed on and really working towards the Buckhead Security Plan, which is essentially like increasing surveillance and in Buckhead and around the city. And so my gut, without having spoken to anyone personally, is that they are probably more in support of not closing the jail and of kind of, you know, this kind of narrative we've been hearing about increased crime rates, and the solution to that being more policing rather than some preventative measures like we've been talking about. The Buckhead Council of Neighborhoods is also an organization that they specifically wrote the street racing ordinance and have been very kind of involved in getting a lot of people to call in and support for keeping ACDC open. So so there's definitely kind of a narrative in Atlanta and Buckhead specifically to kind of like figure out how to kind of take on. And I would say too that I feel like the question about crime rates, like in addition to data and like statistics to share with people, I also feel like this is really where kind of like some conversations around like shared values and, you know, whether that's where your faith comes in or other elements of, you know, like a lot of the video that we shared at the beginning and the idea of, you know, like, I guess I'm thinking more about like that criminals quote unquote aren't just out there waiting. Like there's kind of conditions and there are things that, you know, the social and economic conditions. So like a lot of kind of empathy and perspective taking of like being in kind of people's, being in other people's shoes, and how would you, you know, like how would you kind of provide for your family and things like that are things that kind of come to mind for me.
Next question is like, will closing ACDC without changes in policing and sentencing bring about desired changes? How can that be addressed? Lyla, do you have some thoughts about this? I also have some thoughts about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of closing ACDC is creating the Center for Wellness and Freedom. And so I think that we can't really talk about, you know, all the buzzwords about defunding the police or reducing policing, reducing jails without a conversation about what is there in its place and how is that money allocated in other ways to truly keep our community safe and prevent, and the idea is like prevent harm from happening ahead of time rather than policing and jails, which are very reactive and show up after a harm has occurred. So yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a big piece of, I think, what was so incredible about the Reimagining ACDC Task Force was the reimagining piece and like what needs to be there in its place. And now that I'm on my phone, I'm trying to like awkwardly drop some links. So I'm going to drop some links about that task force and info in the chat box.
Yeah, and then the pieces I have is like paying attention to legislation that increases policing, and so especially ones that are seemingly good, but you want to make sure you read the fine print, right? And so it'd be like, oh yeah, we want there to be less violence. Oh yeah, we want there to be less street racing. Like that's real. Like I want that too. And also the reality is that that maybe this legislation is actually really about racial profiling, or maybe it's actually about cash bail. And so like really looking on like not just the surface of what legislation is saying, but also like what are the ramifications of that legislation. And so like, yeah, I live in Atlanta, I drive, I see how many people are like racing all up and down, and I hate it too, but realizing that's not really what it's about. And it's more about trying to increase this cash bail. So people who can't afford to pay cash bail are just gonna be in jail longer. And so we kind of watching that kind of stuff too. And then have there been significant policing reform efforts in the metro area and/or proposals for redirecting a proportion of criminal justice resources to more appropriate community efforts that we could support? I don't know as much about this, Lyla, maybe you do.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything currently. That was something that tends to come with the budget cycle. So I would definitely look out for that this like May, June. I'm sure we'll start to hear more and more about that at that point. I think, yeah, that's where like kind of the 14 hours of public comment came in, because there were some proposals made by city council members to adjust the city budget to do that. So hopefully we'll see some of that kind of coming up this summer. Or we can ask them for that, yeah.
Beck, there's a comment that I think I wanted to see if you or Lyla had a reaction to this. I think overall crime in Atlanta has gone down, but murder rate is up in the past year. Plus, over half of the cars stolen in Buckhead had the keys in the car.
Well, that last sentence is just self-explanatory, but so yeah, and I would not say that I don't follow crime rates, year to year as directly. Yet again, what I guess I would speak to is when we're talking about crime rate specifically, or like, and I think this thing comes up a lot, and like comes to my mind too when I first thought about like reducing incarceration, is like, well, what about murderers and rapists, right? That's kind of like where our brains go, especially if we are people of privilege and aren't like around people who are imprisoned. And I think that like kind of coming back, so there's like thinking about where that question comes from or where those thoughts come from. Some of it is just like really wanting to understand what's going on, and that's real. And then some of it comes from like deep fear, right? And like there's just a lot of fear when we talk about crime, there's a lot of fear when we talk about incarceration. And so I think that something that's been really helpful for me when thinking about this is like really talking to people who are directly involved with people who have committed murder or have committed sexual assault or things like that. And you kind of have a better idea of like what that actually looks like, especially as far as like recidivism and stuff like that. So like people, and I've been involved in or have friends who are much more deeply involved in mental health related to people who have committed murder or things like that. And the deep spiritual ramifications of having committed murder, like people don't generally, like there are some people who do, like I'm not saying that that's not real, but being real about like people who maybe have committed a murder, like the likelihood of them doing that again. And so when we think about, okay, we're going to lock this person up forever and that's going to stop the person from murdering someone forever, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to reduce murders. So that's the part of like something that I like think about, or I've known a lot of social workers who work in with sex offenders, and looking at how much the likelihood of recidivism is and goes down, especially at age like 40 and beyond. And so that's some of the things they want to think about, right? And so so a lot of things I'm thinking about is also just prison sentences, not even just the amount of people, but also just prison sentences and like lowering those. So yeah, that's kind of like what comes to mind when we start thinking about like, well, okay, like murder is going up or like things like that. Our first instinct is like, okay, we need more policing, we need more jail but also you have more policing, that means more police murders of innocent people. So that doesn't necessarily reduce murder overall.
Beck, can I follow up on some of that? I put
Yeah.
those comments in.
Yeah.
Time for me to admit I live in Buckhead and I attend the Buckhead Civic Association meeting, and they're doing them on Zoom, which makes it really easy and anybody can participate. But they regularly have reports from the local police chief. And that's where I got that over half the cars that are stolen have the keys in the ignition. And I went, what are you idiots doing? Was my reaction. And these people are worried about their cars getting stolen. Well, they go to a gas station, they leave the purse on the seat, the keys in the ignition, and get out of the car and walk away and then complain it gets stolen. They call them slider crimes. And I don't have a lot of sympathy, but the reason that I specified the crime rate's down, even though the murder rate went up, I also sat in on a meeting with my state legislator, and she said the crime rate is up. And I did that double check. Wait a minute, this is what I thought the police officer said. And she came back and said, yes, that is right. The murder rate is up, and we think it's because of COVID and the stress of staying home, and that's what's increasing the murder rate, but overall the crime rate is down. And it's just been in the past year that the murder rate's gone up, which is why they blame it on COVID.
Yeah, and Nancy, I just want to really thank you. Sorry.
It's associated with COVID.
Yeah, Nancy, I want to really thank you for being super involved and for admitting that you're in Buckhead. Like, no, I love that. Thank you. Like, we want to know who's in Buckhead. Like, we want to know. And like, yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Nancy.
So I'm here, and I'll contact my city councilman, although I wish he weren't.
I know that feeling. Yeah, so another thing is like working on the root causes takes a lot of time. What are ideas for dealing with increased crime now? Are there things we can do now?
I see Kay has her hand up.
No, this comment did come before Kay. We can do Kay.
Yeah. Oh, oops, sorry.
No, thank you though. Do you have a thought on that?
I listened to this whole thing with the news that New York has legalized marijuana, and I'm really curious how fast we can move toward decriminalizing drugs and all the corruption and of everything that goes along with that in our system gets unfunded. And we'll then just be dealing with big corporations trying to steal each other's marijuana formula or whatever. That looks something more like crime and not just, bad judgment for people who, and the kind of thing that happens when somebody wants something that's illegal, and what kind of a system you set up to take care of that. And, we might not even be having this conversation if, every drug dealer is out of business and every marijuana user gets what they want down at the Walgreens. So it'll be really interesting to watch this, but I suspect it'll take 10 or 15 years. So
yeah, I suspect that as well. And I think that kind of watching what's going on in Colorado and California has, I think, an interesting, and someone else might know way more than I do about this, but they have an interesting thing where people who, I could be wrong about this, but people who were convicted of selling weed they have like a program. They basically have a program for people who would generally not be able to have a business, to be able to like get funds to start a small business around that, and being able to, because one thing that is kind of cool about it being the way it goes right now is that there is more, it's not corporatized, right? And so if there is a way to legalize it without corporatizing it, that would be really
not
awesome.
in America.
Yeah, maybe. So yeah, going back to the question, working on the root causes takes a lot of time. What are ideas for dealing with increased crime now? Are there things that we can do now? Lyla, I don't know if you want to take a stab at this, or you want me to try?
Yes, my dog is barking in the background. Fun times of working from home, not in-person meetings. So yeah, I do. It feels, this question makes me think of the other one as far as the cycle of poverty and imprisonment feeling like really complicated. And so I think that's where, a lot of what we've been talking about, just the chipping away of it, is what comes to mind for me. And really the public narrative and like the way we talk about public safety, the way we're all talking about it now versus the way it's generally talked about in Atlanta. I mean, I think that shift is so critical and kind of gets back to, not shying away from bringing these conversations up. I think, I can think of conversations that kind of come up with family members of mine after listening to the evening news and, the fear that kind of comes up around this topic. And so how can we kind of talk with those of us that we're close to about how that fear is real, and also how can we kind of distinguish that fear from like really being in danger and like what the consequences of our fear, as white people should be on Black and brown residents in Atlanta. I think that there's a real history of that in our country. And I think, that's where I kind of appreciate Beck starting this with like the heart, the heart and the head. I think there's a lot of like heart work to do within like our white communities, our white families around, around the fear that comes with this conversation.
Yeah. We're at time 8:31. I think what Lyla said is really apt. And I think that there are some things that I feel like we can just like de-incarcerate right now, right? There are some things we can work on de-incarcerating right now. And like, I think Cindy Hoffner had some really great points about that as far as minor crimes, drugs, debtor's prison, things like that. Just go ahead and decriminalize them right now. And then there's other stuff that's just going to take a little bit longer to really get at those root causes. And so that's kind of like where I'm at, is that like, there's some things that we look like can take our time, like maybe we should take our time with, like, I don't know. And Lyla put a link if you want to chat more. There's she's got a Google form you can fill out. But I think that go ahead and decriminalize a lot of this stuff right now, free up the budget from that, and put that, and also demilitarize the police, put that budget into the things that take longer, right? And but maybe actually work. And so that's what my thought is around that, as far as like some of the stuff is just gonna take longer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like there are places that can be shifted right now that that like I don't, it's like I don't think that I'm in danger because my neighbor's smoking weed, right? We're not really in danger here. Like that's not really a safety issue, and so it's like thinking about that kind of stuff.
Did that bill pass that said you can't reduce the police funding more than 5%? Didn't it?
I can't. Kay is nodding yes. I think that I was on medical leave during that whole thing.
Yeah, I do think that was one of the big hits just last week, along with the voting suppression restriction bill,
which makes it, in a way, it shifts some of the emphasis. You've got to do something with the legislature in addition to doing something with the city council in order to address those kinds of restrictions. I mean, the transformation of the criminal justice system is not going to happen with that kind of thinking in the state legislature.
Yeah,
that's a great point. Thanks for
or contract with the police for preventive services.
So like basically getting that reminds me, I meant to say that before. 311, y'all, everyone look into 311 in Atlanta. It's like non-police emergency services basically. First, and you can use that for psychiatric stuff. So if you have someone going through psychiatric, especially the person of color, you call the police. Likelihood of them experiencing police brutality is so high, so call 311 instead. 311. I think it's just in the city. I'm not positive about that one. It's just in the city. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I guess until we can get this 5% thing down, if we could just like contract out with like, get some more like well-trained social workers without guns to go talk to people in mental health crises, like that would be awesome. Like, or at least better. That would be better.
Well, what I'm saying is that it maybe partner with the police in a relatively, I'm sure that they are aware of the need for many of these services. Now, whether they'd free up some of their money, but it'd be a lot cheaper for them out of their budget to contract with a division that handled those kinds of calls than it would be to train full-on police officers and send them out and try to teach them how to differentiate between the two. So, maybe the answer is not dealing with the legislature, but dealing directly with the police.
Good point.
It was like CIT training, the crisis intervention training that police officers, that's like the best one for police officers. And even that is like, it's nowhere near like what you need. It's nowhere near.
It seems completely unrealistic to me.
Yeah. It's just like
somebody that has to use their weapon at times, or has to be on that kind of alert, to not be on that kind of alert. It seems.
Yeah, exactly. And like maybe my last comment before we really need to close it up is that so most people have noticed I have no muscles. I'm very tiny. I am a certified crisis intervention trainer, and I have for less than 5 minutes, because you really don't need more than 5 minutes for most people, I have stopped someone who was very muscular and 6'3" tall from physically stop themselves from self-harming. No, nothing, no restraints, no gun, no nothing. And so if you're properly trained, you don't need any of that. And they don't need to be restrained very long if you know how to do the verbal stuff. And so it's like, some of it's just a lack of imagination about what's possible too, right? It's like as people are like, oh, like their safety. And it's just like, I've been in a lot of situations where people much stronger than me who were trying to kill themselves, and I've stopped, like I've done this lots of times. It's not as like impossible as people think, right? And it doesn't need to be for very long. And so it's like, so there's times when I read the news and I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, it's not like, yeah. And when you teach people to live in fear, like that's how they're gonna respond. And so when you teach people to live in love, it's different. So that's my note. My last note is you gotta live in love to respond to crises.
Well, on that very optimistic note, I want to say thank you very much to Beck and to Lyla, and certainly thanks to Margaret Williams, who is our Zoom tech tonight. And thanks to all of you for coming and joining us this evening. Next week, we have something that is a little bit different, but we hope you will come and join us next week. Next week, it's a discussion on how is adult religious education doing. It gives you an opportunity to provide some feedback and suggestions to the ARE team in advance of the planning for next year. So we really appreciate any discussion that you may have. Come and join us for the entire hour, or if you don't have that much time, just come in and say your piece and leave. But it would really be useful. Laura Beth.
Yes, thanks, June. And I just want to stress too that I'm going to be leading that. I'm going to be facilitating that hour. And we are really looking for stories from you. For those, many of you have been with us faithfully through this year. And I'm also looking for the things that are sticking with you. Like what are the things that we have offered that are still with you? Maybe you're even still wrestling with, that you would like to see more or build on. So it's not, yes, we want to hear about ideas for the future, but I also want to hear about what worked well this year. What did you appreciate? What is still on your heart as a result of what you've experienced this year?
Thanks. Again, thank you to everybody for coming, and I'm going to extinguish our tiny little chalice and say everyone and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.